come back for the second. India have won the test match. India have won the series.
They're going to get back for two. India at home. Lords goes wild.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the 81 All Out podcast. This is your host, Siddhartha Vaidyanathan. And joining me is my co-host, Mahesh. Hi, Mahesh. Good to see you again.
Hey, Sid. Good to be back.
Great. And today we are thrilled to be welcoming a special guest on the show, all the way from Sydney, a doyen of cricket journalism and sports journalism, and someone who's a true exemplar for young writers and journalists to aspire to, and also someone whose work has really shaped my own understanding of cricket and its history and Australian culture and touring and everything. Very, very warm welcome to Mike Coward. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Sid. Nice to see you and nice to meet Mahesh. Nice to be with you both.
Wonderful to have you. And, for those who don't know, and all of you should know, that Mike has been around cricket and cricket journalism for close to 60 years and has had a ringside view of Australian cricket and world cricket for a very, very long time. He's worked for illustrious publications, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Melbourne Age, the Australian. He wrote for the Australian for a very long time. He's the author of 15 books, including a book on Frank Tarrant that came out recently. Frank Tarrant, who was a pioneer in terms of India-Australia relations for cricket and a very, very important figure in Indo-Australian cricket. So, yeah, and Mike has... it won't be an exaggeration to say that Mike has seen it all. I mean, you're going back to the days of Ian Chappell, even before the days of Ian Chappell, and all the way up to the present time. So thanks again, Mike. Great to have you. And we would love to talk to you about your illustrious career where, I mean, it's almost like you're the Forrest Gump of cricket. You've been everywhere.
Yes, well, certainly travelling more than the contemporary journalists are travelling, sadly for them. I mean, that's one of the great joys that I had through the game, is it you can embrace more than just the cricket world, you can embrace the world. And, it's meant so much to me and to my life, being able to be on the road over... My first tour was to Pakistan 40 years ago in 1982. And then it's gone on steadily since then. So I've been very, very fortunate from that point of view.
Yeah, so Mike is the author of one of my favorite cricket books, Cricket Beyond the Bazaar, which came out in 1990, if I'm not mistaken. And it was absolute joy to read when I picked it up. It was one of the first cricket books I read. And, I've told Mike as well that I thought that all cricket books are going to be as enriching and enlightening as Cricket Beyond the Bazaar. And what a disappointment it turned out to be after that. But again, what a joy to read the book. And yes, it includes tours to India and Pakistan through the 80s and marvelous book. But Mike, take us back a bit to the early days, to the 60s when you were growing up. You have written so fondly about, Les Favell and players from South Australia of that time. What was it like to be following that team, to see these people larger than life? Talk a bit about the heroes that you had growing up.
Well, there were many joys. It's always a joy to reflect, Sid. I had a winter god in Australian football and a summer god. And like many boys, and my summer god was Les Favell, of course, who got his 1 century in India, which I think gave me some spiritual link from very early days in 1959 at the old Corporation Ground in Chennai. And of course, I lived in Chennai or south of Chennai for some years. At a little place called Palavakam Nilangri on the Mahapalipuram Road, and spent a lot of time there and very fond of Chennai. So whether it all came from the Favell factor, I don't know. But I was fortunate because Favell was an adventurous cricketer. His biography was called By Hook or By Cut, and that was him. He was a compulsive hooker, compulsive cutter, and he was a thrilling player. And for any boy growing up in Adelaide, in the 50s, it was a thrill to see how he played the game. And of course, he set a standard that was followed. His successor as captain was Ian Chappell. Chappell was succeeded by David Hooks, and David Hooks was succeeded by Darren Lehman. So there you could see in the style of cricket, and in fact, even before Favell, Phil Ridings was a very adventurous. So for boys growing up in Adelaide at that period, there was always that sense of flair. And of course, it is, I still think, the most beautiful cricket ground in the world is Adelaide Oval. It was, I might be somewhat biased, but it is a beautiful ground. It was in its old iteration, as you'll remember, with St Peter's Cathedral and the Moreton Bay fig trees at the northern end, the Torrens at the southern end, some views over the Adelaide foothills. And while it's been turned into a very dramatic stadium, which you would have seen on television, particularly with the Great Southern Stand, which is a remarkable structure, but still kept those qualities. And I can still remember the old days going through the gates under what was then the John Creswell stand. That then was demolished for the Bradman stand, and that was then demolished for the River stand. So you can see that's a hint of age. If you see 3 stands change their name in your lifetime, you know you're becoming a senior player. But there used to be a subway, sort of like a little subway under the Creswell stand. So you would come in through the Creswell gates. John Creswell was an old secretary back in the dim dark ages. And you would come up through the subway onto the ground. And it just to look out over Adelaide Oval then with the Moreton Bay, the cathedral, it was glorious. And they're images you don't forget. And so for me, it was a very important thing, and I've never lost my affection for the ground, and certainly never lost my affection for Les Favell. I'm still in contact with his son, Allan, who played just a handful of Shield games. He's been dead a long time, Les, but he was a very important, and I had the joy of working with him for a while. He was at the Adelaide Advertiser when I was there. He was in promotions, used to take the Advertiser Cricket School to country schools and things like that, while I was the cricket writer for the Advertiser. So I had personal contact as well. And one of the joys was that the hero, he was just a bigger hero off the ground as he was on.
So, yeah, can you just expand a bit about him? Because many of our listeners may not know much about him. They might not have heard much of him. But, in my sort of cricket watching and cricket following experience, there are very few Australian captains about whom there are more stories than Ian Chappell. But Ian Chappell seems to have such a reverence for Les Favell. In fact, there is a joke that often goes on when Ian Chappell is on commentary when people say, okay, how long is it going to take before he mentions a Les Favell anecdote? Because that's how often Ian Chappell brings up Les Favell. So tell us a bit about him and what made him so inspirational and popular among the cricketers of that generation.
I think he was from New South Wales, of course. He was born in Arncliffe in Sydney and played for St George. And, of course, St George produced Bradman, produced Lindwall, produced Arthur Morris. I mean, St George as a club side is just remarkable. We'll be here for half the day telling you all the players who have gravitated from St George. But because of the strength of St George and because of the strength of New South Wales, of course, he was compelled really to leave the state. And many were at that time. Including Graham Hole, who also went to South Australia and played a little of Test cricket. Johnny Martin, quite a number, had to leave because of the tremendous strength of New South Wales cricket. And it is still very, very strong, New South Wales cricket. It's often said that Australian cricket is only as strong as New South Wales cricket, and that's true. It's basically true. It's a bit like the old day with the in the Mumbai Mafia. If you've got all the Mumbai boys together, you're a formidable outfit, and it's been very much the same with New South Wales. And so he went across to South Australia, and he flourished. because he was an adventurous player, and he was an inspiration to those he played with. He had a tremendous sense of humour. He was cheeky, very cheeky. As Chappell would have told you time and time again, and told his listeners all sorts of stories. Remember Bob Bitmead, who bowled off the wrong foot for Victoria, and Bitmead would come into Favell. He had absolutely no respect for slow bowlers. And he would dance down the deck and say, "Happy birthday, Bob," and just hit him anywhere and everywhere. As he was, very charismatic, very cheeky, and he wasn't all that. He was only about 5'8", 5'9", but he was a very, very powerful hooker and cutter. He played Test cricket he toured everywhere except England. He was desperately disappointed that he never got the chance to go to England. That big moment came in the fantastic series in Australia with Australia and the West Indies. And I can still remember my sadness. He had to get runs in the fourth test in Adelaide. And I was sitting behind square leg. He was knocked over for 4 in the first innings and 1 in the second, or vice versa. Caught Alexander, I think both times, once off Worrell and once off Hall. He played so well earlier in the series. He got a brilliant 45, I think, in the tied Test match. Hit Valentine for consecutive sixes, and that got run out by Norm O'Neill. It's not that I'm still resentful of all of that, just not as I can remember it ball by ball, but for a 14-year-old, as I was then, or 15-year-old, it was a distressing moment. But that was his chance. If he'd succeeded in Adelaide in that Test match, he would have gone to England in 61. But, of course, he didn't make it. But he played. He got his 100 in Chennai, or Madras, as then was the corporation ground. Played everywhere else. Played very well in the West Indies in 55 in a couple of critical stands, once with Arthur Morris. So, yeah, he was, as you can see, an important figure in my life growing up.
So important that you remember scores from 60 years ago.
I certainly remember 60, 61. But don't you think that that's the case? You tend, as you get older, the memories are so much more vivid when you were a boy. I mean, you're fascinated, I know, Sid, with children particularly, and young and boys. And I think that is very strong. And I've got, quite detailed memory, a lot of those things, yet I'd struggle, to nominate too much what happened last week.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I mean, I can remember runs and balls, 82 or 49 balls that Tendulkar scored in Auckland in 1994, but I have no idea what happened yesterday and any score of that. So, So yeah, I mean, moving on from your childhood onto the world of journalism and newspapers, you would have entered a world of newspapers that is almost unidentifiable today. I mean, yeah. I can imagine you writing about the newsrooms, and you even mentioned, I think in an interview, that you can identify which paper it was by the smells that were coming out from the printing rooms, which newspaper you worked for. And the whole, I mean, I've seen movies from that time, just the whole industrial nature of those newsrooms, with the typewriters clanking away, the presses going off, the people smoking and shouting. There's sudden heroism there, wasn't there?
Yeah, it was thrilling. It was absolutely thrilling. I started in 1963, which is a bit distressing to mention the figure. That'll be 60 years next year. And I can remember my first day. I can remember exactly what happened on the first day. Going up this was the Adelaide News, from which Murdoch, of course, took News Limited for his international operation. This is where it began. His father, Sir Keith Murdoch, gifted him the newspaper, News Limited, in 116 North Terrace, and that's where I started in December 1963. Yes, I mean, the clatter of the linotype machines, the presses, the whole building would shake when the presses ran. The afternoon papers then had 4 editions. The City and State was on the street by 10 to 11 in the morning, the last for the day at 10 past 4. So I've always believed, and I've been very fortunate, the best training historically for a young journalist was afternoon newspapers and the agencies. If you could master the deadlines and the challenges of working against the clock always, you could make it. And afternoon papers were, obviously because of the time factor, were incredibly demanding, like an agency was. So I was very fortunate. But to give you an idea, when I moved to Melbourne in the late 60s, before I went to England, I worked for the Melbourne Herald. And the year they landed on the moon, was that 69? I think 1969. I was working for the Herald at 44 Flinders Street, Melbourne, and 1.2 million papers were coming out of that building every day. 625,000 Suns in the morning, a tabloid in the morning, and 510 to 515,000 broadsheets in the afternoon. Broadsheets that were sold on the street by boys on the corner. So that's a 1.1 or 1.2 million papers a day coming out of one building off the same presses. I mean, you talk to young ones now about those sorts of figures. They just look at you absolutely bewildered that it could actually happen. But they were the days, it was a rich, exciting, vibrant industry. And I was very, very fortunate to be a part of it.
If you talk to a young person and tell them about the 1.2 million papers that came out of a building, they'll probably say, oh, that's how many hits my YouTube video got yesterday. So,
yes, exactly.
Well, you spoke about England. And again, I forgot to mention early in the introduction, and it's remiss of me, that Mike received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Australian Sports Commission in November 2015. I mean, an extremely prestigious moment. And also, you gave a speech at that time. And you spoke about those years in England, which again seems like straight out of fantasy. I mean, the kind of events that you covered and the kind of people that you met. Did you say you took a taxi with Rod Laver?
Yes, I did actually. It was a very, very wet night, and he had just won. He beat Ilyana Stasi on boards at the Albert Hall. You can imagine the speed of that game. So Rocket Rod, who we saw here just the other day, of course, coming down for the Australian Open, he's doing it pretty hard these days in his 80s with poor health, but he's still a vibrant character. But yes, he was given one of those checks, those massive checks that the sponsors give. I don't know how much he got. It was a fair sum, say 15,000, 20,000 pounds or whatever it might have been back in, probably not that much, given the Fleet Street minimum was 2,500 pounds for the year, I might tell you. 2,500 for the year was my starting wage in England. And anyway, so that's very good AAP sort of salary. And so I was just standing outside the Albert Hall, and I had an old Morris Minor, which I bought from a mate for 70 quid. And nobody was picking him up and taking him back to the Kensington Palace Hotel. So I said, do you want a lift? Because it was belting down the rain. He said, yeah, I'd be very grateful. It was such an Australian moment. So in he jumped with his 20,000 quid and his rackets, and off we went back to the Palace Hotel. And one of those very pretentious doorman that you find everywhere, but particularly in England, he said, I see you've come in style tonight, Mr. Laver. And Laver just looked at him and said, I've come with an Australian friend. So it was forehand cross-court from Laver to the doorman.
Oh, my goodness. Mahesh watches more tennis than me. I mean, I can see his jaw dropping right now.
No, I was just blown away. I had no idea. So as it is, like when he mentioned the Forrest Gump thing, I didn't know that you had worked on the Type Test documentary or the 1960-61 series documentary for ABC, right?
Yeah. On the first Type Test and the famous
on the Type Test, yeah, in Chennai, yeah.
In Chennai.
No,
not the Chennai
Brisbane
one, the first one, the Brisbane one. So we had a chat with Michael Sexton on his book on the Type Test. And at that time, I went back to both these documentaries. And I was telling Sid, it's quite possible that apart from Bobby Simpson, Mike Covert is the only one who's had such a close sort of affinity to both the type tests, and is probably the best person to evaluate, the merits and demerits of both tests, or the comparison of both the type tests. And then I saw the speech of yours, and then there's the Rod Laver coming in. I'm like, this whole Forrest Gump story went to a whole new level. How many people can connect Gary Sobers, Rod Laver, Ian Chappell, and all the subsequent legends that we've seen? It's just an incredible story. My jaw just completely dropped. Siddhi shared that video, and I wasn't sure if I heard Rod Laver right. I asked him, did he mention Rod Laver there? And he says, yes. I was completely blown away by that.
For a young journalist to be in England for those 3 years, and not just Rod Laver, not just tennis. I mean, you were covering boxing. You went to the Munich Olympics in 1972. Yeah. How brilliant is that? And then just that experience would have been so formative.
Well, I was very lucky, really. I mean, I know you make your luck, but at the same time, I mean, it's a sort of rite of passage for most in those days, for most Australians. We've always been fairly inveterate travellers. I think it's something to do with the sort of geographical isolation and the need to travel. And so off we went, and I didn't go to any job. Murdoch had just taken over the Sun, and I subbed on the Sun for a very short period, and not a particularly good sub and not particularly interested in it. And then an opportunity arose at AAP because they wanted someone, because there was so much Australian sport happening, or Australians in sport happening in Europe. So, I was very fortunate. The Commonwealth Games in 1970, I went to Paris in 70 and 71 for the tennis, and where the Australians were conspicuous, of course, because Margaret Smith, or Margaret Court as she now is, Yvonne Goolagong. I saw the Goolagong. I saw I was at the Wimbledon ball when Goolagong danced with Newcombe, the two champions. I mean, what a privilege to witness something like that. I was very, 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 very fortunate. And the golf as well, and the British Open at St Andrews in 1970, at Birkdale in 71, and it was the timing, and I've just learned so much from that, and from that experience and development, not only as a journalist but as an individual, that you bring that back into your career in Australia.
The shock for me, Mike, is that you weren't with Neil Armstrong on the moon.
No, I felt a tad left out. See, a tad left out.
How could you miss out on that? You have just missed out, Mike. I don't know what to say. But yeah, so you get back to Australia, and and also the one thing that you did when you were in England was to cover the 1972 Ashes, which was such a pivotal moment for Australian cricket, because Ian Chappell was pretty much in his early days in his captaincy.
Yeah, very much so. And in fact, that's where I really, where I got my start, really. Historically, AAP had usually taken a journalist, a cricket writer from Australia who wasn't being sent by his newspaper. But because they decided I was there, that I would do the tour. So I was really the first one to do it for AAP in that context. And I was very, very fortunate, and particularly in the second Test match at Lords, when Massey took the 16 for 137, and you can imagine the pressure with the 9-hour time difference and all the rest of it. And Richie, I'll never forget this. Richie Benaud, who didn't know me from Adam, really, he came across when it was going full flat chat, and Massey was just knocking him over left, right and centre, and I was having to replace top, and one thing and another, as AAP journalists have to do. And he just came over and said, are you managing all right? Is there anything I can do to help? Now, here's the just great Australian captain and a very fine journalist and writer and broadcaster who didn't know me from Adam, but knew the importance of the AAP cover, and also, more than happy to support a young journo from his country. And we ended up having a wonderful relationship, and I still see his widow, Daphne, now. She's in her 80s, and in fact, this week said it was the 2 for 222 day. And there was a special celebration in Melbourne for the 2 for 222. The Lord's Tavern is one of the great cricket charities with which I know you're familiar. They had a special dinner for the 2 for 222, and Daphne flew down from Sydney to be part of the occasion, which was just a lovely little aside. But yeah, I was very lucky that Richie was supportive of me in the early stages. I was only 25 then, and you're sort of thrown in the deep end.
Absolutely, I think it's a really touching and humbling moment when a cricketer of great stature and a person of great stature generally is so supportive and understanding of one's pressures. So yeah, 72. And I think what Richie Benaud did and his approach to young journalists is something that continued with Ian Chappell. And, Chappell as a broadcaster and as a journalist has been equally supportive of so many younger people coming through and who all mention his support. And I think that's a good connection running through.
Yeah, very much so. And particularly Richie's techniques too, because he was so economical in what he said and so thoughtful. Often people were quite intimidated by his silences. But as you know, as we all know, as more senior journalists, the silences can just say so much. And he was very, very good.
Yeah, I mean, I was recently, there was this, the anniversary of the famous or infamous underarm delivery. And I was just rewatching Richie's sum up of the game and sum up of the day. And it's so unique and so unimaginable in this day and age of such high volume. I mean, he basically distilled what happened. He put forth his opinion. He had that bit of sharp criticism, and it was all done with such dignity and such, in such a civil way. I don't think we're unlikely to see that ever again. That level of. Yeah.
No, well, one of the real sadnesses, of course, is the broadcasting has changed. There's still some very good broadcasters, mind you, but generally broadcasting and cricket writing has changed so dramatically. I mean, World Series cricket did that more than anything. I mean, people just talk about the impact that had on the game, which was, of course, profound. But what people don't often recognise, that the impact it had on the way the game was understood, the way the game was written about, the way the game was talked about, the way the game was broadcast, generally the way the game was thought. I mean, its impact, that period, that revolutionary period, and we're still seeing it today. I mean, all the things we're seeing today, the BPL, BBLs, the IPLs, all the rest of it, they all were formed from that, basically, as it's all evolved from that.
Yeah, I mean, the other Forrest Gump moment, of course, is that your the first series of World Series cricket was also one of your first full-on cricket assignments, right? To cover the series. And how sort of magical and revolutionary it must have all been at that time and all felt. It might have felt like cricket's being pulled apart in two different directions and you're just watching the whole thing.
Yeah, and it was difficult too on many levels, because what it did do, it polarised. It polarised the community, but it also polarised the cricket writing community. So there was tensions within the group. I tried to steer as much as possible a middle course. I can remember at one stage we were summoned by Mr. Packer. He was always Mr. Packer, to the presidential room of the Sheraton Hotel in Perth. And I must say, there was a little, what would you say, apprehension within the members of the Fourth Estate going up to the presidential suite. What were we going to encounter? And there he was, sitting behind this enormous desk, as you would expect the potentate to be behind the desk. And he basically dressed us down, saying that he didn't think our coverage was quite fair enough, that there might have been a leaning towards the establishment away from the revolutionaries. So it was an interesting mix of people who were summoned, but it was an astonishing time. I mean, Ian Chappell has always said it was the hardest, toughest cricket he'd ever played. Certainly the quality of the play was remarkable. Of course, there was the emptiness because of the emptiness of the stadiums, the emptiness of the events, something a little bit like we've seen through COVID, how there's an emptiness that, you just can't compensate for, for that sort of emptiness, however good the standard might be out in the middle. So it was a difficult time from that point of view. But one story, just to go to show how things have changed. The Australian team were practicing at Moorabbin at St Kilda outside Melbourne in the very early days when I started to cover that tour. And so I was standing inside the pickets at Moorabbin with my back to the pickets, and Chappell was organising the training in front of me. And at the end of it, he called me over and said, Mike, you won't know these such and such. So he knew the 5-6 players who were in that squad that I wouldn't know, and he introduced me to them. Now, can you imagine in this day and age, a captain being that connected in the circumstances? I mean, it was incredibly. I mean, okay, we were both from Adelaide, and we had a very good rapport. But I never forgot the generosity of spirit in doing that, because I mean, he's a media man as well as being a cricket man, obviously. But I just thought that said a lot about the man, because he's renowned not only for his acumen as a captain, as a strategist and tactician, but of course he's most renowned for his loyalty and his honesty. He can be brutally blunt, as you well know. But, no man or all men should be commended for honesty and loyalty. And that's the love and respect he still has from his players today.
Absolutely. I mean, Ian Chappell even talks about stories where he was so blunt with some of the journalists who were critical of him, but then ended up having a drink into the early hours of the morning with them, because once they sort of had a conversation with him, once they patched it out, and then after that he was like, okay, let's move on, let's get a drink. And so that's a very, very different kind of relationship between media and players. Again, not something that we can see today.
No, sadly, that's one of the most significant things that's happened in my time, is the breakdown in trust between the two groups. The players don't trust the journos with the same as they once did, and the journos don't trust the players as they once did. And of course, I mean, it's an argument that's nearly impossible to have because of social media. I mean, it's a completely different world. I mean, the players didn't feel. They would still have their little groups, and there would perhaps be a little bit of uneasiness about talking in front of certain individuals, but nothing like they have to contend with today. You can understand why they're so withdrawn, and that's one of the great sadnesses.
Sorry, just to go back on the World Series cricket, you said it was polarizing at that time, but after a few years, perhaps even as early as the 90s, the whole narrative about WSC changed so positively that retrospectively everybody talks about it as this great revolutionizing impact on cricket, and nobody talks about the negative effects it had at that time. Why do you think that view has changed so much in fairly short time, in about 10 years maybe?
It's a difficult one, Mahesh. Attitudes, I think, as post-World Series, attitudes have changed so quickly. The game has evolved so quickly and so abruptly that there's nearly a sort of, John Arlott always said it's a microcosm of society, didn't he? Always said, and he's right. And I mean, probably you in India have seen the most extreme changes since that World Series cricket period. I think it's absolutely fascinating that whole question of the revolution and the way the attitudes have changed and the abruptness. It's hard to pinpoint. I think that the power, obviously the power has moved away from England and now has moved away from Australia. India is now the most powerful cricket nation on earth and is calling the shots. Whether it is doing it with the level of responsibility that some of the affiliates would hope is a big, broad question can always be debated. But it's very hard to pinpoint exactly why. But I think a lot of it is a consequence of the revolutionary spirit, which is still alive and well in the game. Look at the restlessness in our country at the moment. The instability at board level, the instability within the they've been a successful side, yet they're being pulled apart. Look at England. England is in absolutely, more trouble than the early settlers. These were the two most powerful influences in world cricket for so many years. And I don't know whether they've actually coped all that well, either of them, with a subsidiary role. They have been used to calling the shots for so long. And, it's the post-colonial, environment. It's very, very interesting, these shifts. But I think a lot of it can be sheeted back to the attitudes post-World Series cricket.
Also, the other attitudinal shift that happened through the 70s was, of course, the manner in which, Australia played their cricket and was seen to play their cricket with the Ian Chappell's team and Dennis Lillee, Rod Marsh, Greg Chappell. There was a sudden masculinity, if I may call it so, play hard, party hard, drink, all night, but come back the next day and play. There was a certain aggro, I think, that happened. And of course, that moved on from over time. And then you had mental disintegration and all that crept in much later with the sledging and everything. Was that a big deal at that time when you were covering? Was it always there through the 50s and 60s, or was the 70s pivotal in how the players approached the game and their aggression?
Yes, I think that's the perfect illustration of the microcosm of society, the change. I think when you look at the clothing that they wore, look at the length of their hair, and the free-spirited, it was a free-spirited time, and there wasn't. Chappell took a lot of flack. Some of it was justified, some of it not, but he took a lot of flack for the behaviour. But there were some very passive, articulate people within that team as well. It's a bit like, the Australian team of 1 or 2 years ago, where there were just 2 or 3 absolute hard heads. There's always been some hard heads. But what that has done, of course, is that it's nearly compelled opposing teams to develop a similar method of operation. And, of course, one of the great criticisms of Australian teams in more recent years has been that they can dish it out, but they don't like it when when they get it back. And this was certainly a classic case with Ranatunga. Ranatunga could read the Australians perfectly. He had their measure. He gave them heaps. And, of course, he would sledge in a language they didn't understand, which made them even angrier, whether it was Sinhala or whatever. There's no quicker way to get to the Australians but to sledge in your own tongue. Give them a little bit of Hindi or a little bit of Urdu, or a bit of patois out of the Caribbean, and that gets them onto the back foot so quickly. That's the way to play them. Ranatunga was a master. So I think if there's a sadness, that has been it, that there are countries that believe that the only way to be competitive with Australians is to play the same way. I think you'll find that at the moment it's being modified. There's a different maturity, and the Australian male is a very different. The Australian male of the 21st century, certainly the ones who were born in this century, are are very, very different in outlook, a lot more aware, a lot more socially aware, politically aware. I think you'll find actually over the next 10 years, and particularly if the likes of Cummins stays in the job for a while, you'll see a very different approach. That's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. They can still be very successful. But yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that the 70s changed it. I won't begin to try and apportion blame. I don't think there's any point in doing it. But it was a very tricky time, but certainly a reflection of the wider society.
Absolutely. And then there's also occasionally you hear stories of the so-called misfits, right? I mean, players who were good at their game, but who didn't really fit into the culture of that particular team, who didn't necessarily like to go out and party in the night, or who didn't necessarily play with the sign of aggression. And then you learn about how they didn't really have too much of a stint, perhaps because of their game, and not necessarily only because of this, perhaps because they weren't good enough as well, but also this played a bit of a part. You surely have heard things like that.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I think it still happens today. I think it still happens today. I mean, there were some figures who were just so much larger than life. You know, Marsh was larger than life. Lilly was larger than life. Greg Chappell, not so. I mean, he
but
just,
so good.
He just let the bat do the speaking, really, didn't he? I mean, the 131 at Lord's in 1972 was the most beautiful. Probably, I would have it still in my top 5 of the best hands. I mean, it's ridiculous after so many years to but because to even think of them. I mean, I can think of X number of Tendulkars, of Dravids, and of Laras, and Greenwiches, and one thing or another. But it was very, very special. But again, what we were saying earlier, heightened by the period, by my age, by my first test tour. But Chappell himself rates it as his finest hand. And it was a very beautiful hand at Lord's, and an absolutely pivotal one. Not only was the Massey 16 for 137, there was his leisurely 131. Yes, I mean, it's I don't know, Sid. See, K.D. Walters. Now, there's a classic case. I mean, Walters, one of the great characters. I mean, they always talked of the amount of beer he consumed, the number of cigarettes. At his peak, he was 80 cigarettes a day. It was only in recent years when he had hypnotherapy that he stopped smoking. But he's still there. He was still at the Sydney Test match this year, still doing his gags and one thing and another for appreciative crowds at the end of the day, still telling the same old yarns, and they still love him.
Absolutely. Which then brings me to the period when you began to travel a lot to cover cricket, which was the 80s. And of course, another turbulent period for Australian cricket with the retirements and with, World Series cricket, of course, was done with. So it was back to cricket. But there was a huge transition period. And you pretty much had the ringside view of Allan Border, taking over the captaincy and then trying to shape a team. And you watched them through the 80s and through to the 86 tight test in Madras, the 87 World Cup win. And tell us a bit about that period. Tell us a bit about Border as a captain and as a figure who I think over time has become, whose contributions are probably not as valued as they should be, at least in my reading from afar. But you have obviously done more than your share to highlight Allan Border's great achievements. Yes,
well, I've been an unapologetic supporter of Border because, in fact, to such an extent, I think it's not unreasonable to say in the pecking order you go Bradman, Benaud, Border. I don't think that's an unreasonable argument to put. I mean, Bradman, he's just in another league. Benaud always had support, always had really good players around him, or mostly. And he had the vision. And, of course, he had the rapport with Bradman, who was then chairman of selectors. And the two of them came together really to reinvigorate Test match cricket in 1960. Border had nothing, absolutely nothing. That's why he became very dependent on Bob Simpson. I mean, Border didn't want the captaincy, really. He saw the way it had treated Kim Hughes. Hughes and Border were good mates, and he was his vice captain, and he didn't like what the position did to Hughes and the associated pressures. He didn't really want the job. In fact, in 1986, before the famous Indian Tide Test tour, they went to New Zealand, and he virtually said, I can remember in Dunedin, that he didn't appear for a press conference, and we were all wondering what's going on here. And David Boone, who didn't like his vice captain, who didn't like the sort of the roles of captain or vice captain to have to come out to speak to an unsuspecting public, Boone appeared for the press conference. And as it turned out, Border had just put up his hand and said, enough. I will not continue. I will not play on if I don't get your unqualified support for what I'm trying to achieve. It was incredibly dramatic. And it was a cry. It was a cry for help. It's what it was. I mean, all of us here have seen the number of captains who have had mental health issues because of the pressures of the game. I mean, we've seen it with Steve Smith in recent times. We're seeing it with Joe Root at the moment. I don't know about the situation with Dhoni and Kohli at that time, whether there was any suspicions there. Certainly, I think with Tendulkar, who just wasn't up to the leadership when he was in this country, he had issues around it. And we've seen it in the Caribbean as well. But with Border, I've never seen an elite player and a leader so close to a breakdown as he was then. But he got through New Zealand, Simpson playing a more significant role. And then by the time he got to India, I still remember the first press conference before the Chennai, before the Tide Test, and how edgy he was. He snapped a fairly straightforward question. He just snapped. And it's so unlike Border. And, of course, the pressure of the next 5 days in that, what Chennai's like. And it was unbelievable. But what a game. 2 declarations, Chappell just as brave as AB. Chappell's 100, unbelievable. And Gavaskar's, I reckon, 80 or 90 in the second innings was as good a hand as I've seen. And his square driving off one knee off McDermott, you just wouldn't believe. I mean, he was just down on one knee and just hitting square in front and behind point was just thrilling to watch. It was a lot more thrilling to watch than it was to cover, I can tell you, the pressures of an open press box in 38-degree heat or whatever it was. And I was working on an old NEC typewriter with thermal paper. So with thermal paper, the sweat is pouring off your brow onto the thermal paper, and all these priceless words are disappearing as quickly as they're formed. And of course, you've got a 5.5-hour time difference. It ended at something like 9:30 or 9:45 at night Australian time. I said to my colleagues then, if we get through this match, the Tide Test, and we didn't miss, we might have missed a cycle, but we never missed an addition. And in India in the 80s and Pakistan in the 80s, with the telex machine and having to bribe the telex operators mainly with cigarettes, if you didn't miss a cycle, you're doing very, very well. So we might have missed a cycle, but we never missed an addition.
And as you had sweat pouring down your head and cheeks onto the thermal paper, you have Greg Matthews wearing jumpers right in the middle.
Just to make another point for the unsuspect. Yeah, he was probably trying to speak Tamil at that point anyway.
I love the fact that he not only did that, not only wore the jumpers in that infernal heat of Madras, but then he also tried to give like a thermodynamic explanation for it, about how all the heat would be trapped inside.
Yeah, everybody was somewhat bemused, none more than Maninder Singh. And of course, the next day, a few of us stayed overnight because, it was just too dramatic, but they had to get onto the plane that night to go to Hyderabad for the first of the limited over internationals. It was just the schedules. People talk about the schedules now. Well, how about getting on a plane at 8 o'clock after a tied test match?
Actually, I found it very funny. In the book, for instance, you talk about the fact that they went on a tour of India, right? They went to Red Fort, they went to Taj Mahal, they went to a lot of places before coming to Chennai for the test. So they had so much time before the test. But after the test, the same night, they had to go to Hyderabad, which is kind of funny.
Yes. Yeah, I know. It was a complete lap of honour, as you say, in advance of it. It was extraordinary. Were we in Jaipur, I think? I can't remember exactly, but it was. But from that point on, it was pretty frenetic. Yeah, just to kind of hold on to, sorry, said I'm hijacking some time for Chennai here. I'm from Chennai, and I was quite pleased to read your writing on the game, and particularly how you capture the city and the city, even the little sort of like, for instance, one of the passages in the book talks about how you can go from Taj Coromandel Hotel to the stadium, and there are two ways. You can go via Mount Road or via RK Salai, and how you go depends on the whims and fancies of the driver that day, and so on. And all those little details so beautifully captures the city. Like, for someone who's lived there, I can get so much out of it. Imagine if you've never been there. It gives you that sense of color and the vibe of the place so beautifully. And and you also wrote the book sitting somewhere in Palavakkam in a beach, right? Yeah, a lot of it. Thank you, Mahesh. That's a nice compliment. And of course, the Mount Road has my favourite sign of all, I think, of all my Indian signs: please observe lane discipline, which I think is my favourite sign of all, I think, in Chennai. Observe lane discipline. Just spectacular. It's a wonderful town. I've got great affection for it and the people. Yes, I'm going to take a lot of credit for the beaches of Chennai for the quality of that book.
But Mike, we can stick to Chennai. I have no problem. My parents grew up there, so I do have a connection. But for many Australian journalists of that time, and for many Australian players of that time, India was like a hardship tour.
Oh, very much.
Very much. And you have written in detail about how the 60s had such a big role to play for that. Australia didn't even tour for a long time after 69 until 79, for 10 years. And then, of course, they started going more. But, it wasn't Bangalore, which is my city. It wasn't many other cities, but it ended up being Madras that they eventually got so attached to, and you got so attached to. And so talk a bit about that. What was the pull? Was there something that really drew you there? Did you observe? Was it the sheer passion that you saw? What was it about Madras and India that really drew you in?
That's a very good question, Sid. I don't know. I was adopted. I'm an adopted child. I didn't know my birth parents, although I've since discovered that there was some connection in New Zealand. But I often felt when I got to India, I didn't know whether there was some sort of pull or whether perhaps I just hoped there was. I don't know. But what I can say is that from the first time I arrived in the subcontinent, and that was 82 in Pakistan, I have never, ever felt out of place. I've never felt uncomfortable, never felt out of place, never felt intimidated. I've always felt that the part of me belongs there. And so that's where the comfort came, I think. And then the cricketers just followed. Certainly the 82 tour of Pakistan was very, very different to what was to follow. It just loss followed loss followed loss. riots in Karachi. The last one-day game was rioted off, and the students weren't getting their drinking water on the hills. So they burnt down the shamianas. And so, I mean, all of that was going on in the 80s in Pakistan particularly. And I suppose, in a sense, that we found India incredibly welcoming. I think it's probably the best way to explain it. I've never, ever felt out of place there, always felt comfortable there. And, of course, the cricket was just priceless. I mean, we've had some wonderful cricket in that period.
Yeah, I mean, they're reading the book. I would urge everyone to read the book. But, there is a certain kind of writing there that you don't see often from visiting journalists in India. And a part of that has also got to do with the whole spiritual and metaphysical experiences that you can tend to feel in India. Mike writes very fondly about the cricket and about the people and about, he has, I think, Lord Ganesha is one of his favorite deities. He brings up Lord Ganesha quite often. But you seem to get how religion and spirituality plays such an integral role in Indian life, even though even though you don't necessarily see it on the surface.
Yeah, that's very true. And it's nice to hear. One of my great mates there is Ramaswamy Mohan, the very, very fine writer and journalist and editor. And he dropped one of the great lines to me of all time. I was trying to explain to him what I'm trying to explain to you now, what I felt and why I felt it. And he looked me dead in the eye and he said, "Mike, why do you need to know?" And that is just there's our need in the West perhaps to rationalise everything, whereas the Indian, he just looked me dead in the eye, "Mike, well, why do you need to know? Accept it for what it is. You're embracing it. It's embracing you. Just enjoy it. Revel in it." And it was a very good lesson to learn from Mohan. I learned plenty from Mohan and many other of the Indian guys, but it was a good one to learn early. But you're quite right, Sid. I mean, it was a period where the fear of the Indian tour or any tour of the subcontinent, I mean, they left with a prejudice. They left that they weren't going to enjoy it. They weren't going to like it. And all the stories from the 50s and the 60s, those very few tours, the inevitable rat in the front bar and all that sort of stuff. There's a great story with Jeff Marsh in 86. Some rat ran across a bar or ran across a veranda or something, and a couple of them carried on like poor, silly kids. And Marsh said, "Oh, that's just like the rats I have in the silos at home," just to try and bring it back to, let's get a handle on this. So I give enormous credit to Border, Steve Waugh and Mark Taylor, particularly those three, for the way they led and re-educated the Australians into embracing that part of the world, which they now do, of course, and some of them making very, very big money out of it, whether they're playing or whether they're broadcasting. But it has changed. The attitudes have changed enormously, and those three really, as leaders, deserve tremendous commendation for that.
Yeah, and on the flip side, I mean, just as Border and Steve Waugh and Taylor have been embraced so fondly by the Indian spectators, on the flip side, that was also the time in the late 80s with the emergence of Tendulkar, who the Australians took to so fondly. And in fact, Tendulkar, some of Tendulkar's great innings have come in Australia, some of his absolutely majestic performances. And I was fortunate enough to be on a tour in 2008 when he made a magnificent 100 in Sydney. And for me, just being there and watching the warmth of that crowd and to see the appreciation of everybody there, it was quite remarkable. I mean, in my reading, I don't think too many Indian cricketers or too many cricketers from outside Australia have been treated with so much respect and warmth. Would you agree?
Yeah, very much. Very much agree. Very few. David Gower was embraced and loved openly. Gatting at a different level, but because there's Gat played a bit of cricket in Sydney. But I would say, other than Gower in my time, some of the West Indians, but Lara was popular, but there was never the passion that there is with Tendulkar. Interestingly, with Tendulkar, he came out with the Cricket Club of India side and had his 16th birthday in Sydney. And they played a game out at Drummoyne. And I was invited, I watched the game and then made a presentation for his 16th birthday. And I've been fortunate to spend and interview Tendulkar quite a lot for television and for the newspapers and one thing and another. And he got a very good rapport with him and liked him very much. Always was disappointed that he wasn't going to be the leader that India wanted him to be. But I don't know whether, after a career like that, it's picking holes, isn't it? To regret that he wasn't a better leader. But that's true. It's true. I think Gower is the only other one that leaps quickly to mind that evokes that sort of affection.
I need to definitely read up a bit more about the CCI tour. It sounds so fascinating that he went there as a 16-year-old and we know so little about it. So, I need to dig up a bit about this.
I think you'll find there's some obscure little exercise with the CCI.
I thought he knew everything about Sachin. I thought his career was the most documented cricket career of all time. And yet we find something new.
Yes, it'd be a hard news story, wouldn't it, Mahesh, if we found a tour or a game that the statisticians was oblivious to. Yeah, it'd be fun.
And it'll be a shocker if we found a small snippet about how Tendulkar was caught in a bar or something as a 16-year-old. But
there's a photograph of Sachin holding a beer mug when he was with Yorkshire.
Yeah. Yorkshire.
Like I had never seen that, I think, till he was about 28 or 30. So in my mind, I always imagined Sachin was a teetotaler. And then I see this teenager holding a beer, like 10 years after it had happened. And I was like, oh my God, so Sachin was always alive to this.
But how much of that adoration would you attribute to that one comment by Sir Don about the likeness of his batting, or rather by Lady Bradman?
Lady Bradman, yeah.
Lady Bradman. Do you think that had a big role?
Oh yeah. There's no doubt about that. Yeah. Bradman was a challenging man, but he was the master. But it always must be said, and that he played his entire career in 2 countries on 10 grounds. I mean, Tendulkar played in so many countries on so many grounds in so many different conditions, and still had that extraordinary record. Yes, I think Lady Bradman, who was a lot more approachable than was Sir Donald, she was a wonderful woman, very warm. She was the only person who could say to Sir Donald, "Oh, don't be silly, Don." The only person who could say, he was, the great criticism of Bradman was everything always had to be done at his terms. And that was what offended so many people. It was he always had the last word. Everything was done at his terms. Mind you, he wasn't often wrong, but as a player or as an administrator or as a selector. But he was just so definite, so inflexible. Whereas Lady Bradman, she was just the most gorgeous woman. She was a jeweler, she was a gardener. She grew, just loved being in the garden. She did a lot of charity work. There was sadness in their family. John, the son, who's in his 80s now, had polio as a boy, and she had to turn him every night, every half an hour. Shirley, the daughter, had cerebral palsy, and their first child they lost after 1 or 2 days. So there was tremendous sadness in their personal life, and that would have, in some ways, played into the way he approached everything in life. Down at the Bradman Museum and International Cricket Hall of Fame at Bowral, there's two long interviews, one with Bradman and one with Tendulkar on the loop. So the hour finishes with Bradman, you go straight into the hour with Tendulkar. And that sort of says it all, really.
You must have definitely interviewed Bradman. Tell us about that and tell us about him. Obviously you have interviewed Bradman.
Yeah, I was quite fortunate. I got the only interview with him for the 50 years of Bodyline in 1983. And I was then working for The Age in Melbourne and went to Adelaide, and he was very generous with his time. As it turned out, here's another indication, of course, he had to see the copy. That was the condition when the editor spoke to him and asked whether he would agree to an interview with me for it. He said yes, but that was the condition.
Wasn't he a pressman? Wouldn't he know?
Oh, yes, he was. He was. Yes, he was.
But he still insisted.
And got his way, as ever. But he was very generous. We sat in the front room of his place at Kensington Gardens with his piano there because he loved his music. He was a good pianist. And his granddaughter Greta now has got quite a celebrated career as a singer and broadcaster. And he was very good. But as it turned out, what he wanted to do was to make yet another public statement that he wasn't frightened at the Oval in 1930 when he got hit. That he didn't get hit, that he ducked and weaved, but Archie Jackson got hit and was black and blue. And there was always, it was believed that Jardine adopted the tactics because they saw at the Oval in 1930 a vulnerability, a weakness. Perhaps he was scared. And that's how it all was devised. And I know full well that after the article appeared, that he did send it to his great mate Gubby Allen in England, because it was again an explanation, because Allen played in that England side, of course, in 32-3, that was an explanation yet again how he felt and how had been misunderstood and misinterpreted the way he behaved in that test match in 1930. So that was basically why I used the interview.
Moving on from Bradman to a cricketer who is probably as opposite to Bradman as they can ever be, but who is equally an Australian icon, is Shane Warne. And you saw Shane Warne right from his early days. You covered so much of Warne. You probably covered his entire career, if I'm not mistaken. Well. And you also saw, Warne's relationship with India and Tendulkar and generally the kind of, I don't even know how to describe it. He just came out of nowhere. And, Gideon Haigh has written so fondly about him in his book. You have written so fondly about him. Tell us a bit about early Warne and how it was a spotting of a shooting star.
Yeah, well, it all began, of course, in Sri Lanka when he, after he got hammered here in Sydney, and Shastri took him to pieces, and one thing the other is only Ravi could when he's in that sort of mood. It was interesting when he had success in Sri Lanka, bowled Australia to victory in a match that Sri Lanka should never have lost. It was their naivety, really, the Sri Lankans' naivety that cost them. I can remember Gunasenna still shocked that it could actually happen. They were in such a precious position, and Warne bowled well. But it was interestingly, it was the support that he got from Matthews at the other end. Matthews settled him down. And to think Matthews could settle anyone down is a hard news story. But Matthews settled him down, encouraged him, and along with Border, they cajoled him into that performance. That gave him a lot of confidence, and then on he went. And of course, as he has said publicly, it was the Gatting ball in England that changed his life. I mean, he's the most enigmatic figure probably that I've ever known in the game, or one of. I mean, he's approachable. He can be difficult. You name it. But, you know, you would always find yourself leaning forward in your seat at the cricket. I mean, how often are you always leaning forward in your seat at the cricket? You know, you certainly would be for Tendulkar. You certainly, but you always were for Warne. And that just says so much about the man. I mean, as an individual, nothing stuck. I mean, he was extraordinary. He had more front than foys. In Australia, we've got an expression, you got more front than foys. You know, foys was a great big department store. So you say, oh, he's got more front than foys. And he has got more front than foys. And he's unapologetic about it. So he's a difficult one to size up, Sid, except that he was a master at his craft. You know, Bill O'Reilly was a genius leg spinner. We've seen some very fine ones. Abdul Qadir was seriously underrated as a
Richie Benaud himself.
Benaud himself. You know, many appreciated, and the work he did. And one of Warne's great qualities was that wherever he would go, he would encourage and support the leg spinners who were there. His other great quality is, while he could be a difficult and contentious figure, he was a very, very good parent, an extremely good parent, and known for that, which I know would strike a chord with you. So however erratic his behaviour might have been, he was always loyal and a very good parent. And that says a lot for him.
And as a journalist covering him and covering his career, you know, how easy was it? How infuriating was it? Because very often you would be drawn to write about things that had nothing to do with this cricket, because he was drawn to so much of he was so larger than life. And how challenging was it, or did it just make it that much more exciting? Did it drain you out? How was it?
Yeah, I think it was exhausting, really. I mean, he does exhaust you in most ways. You know, it's sort of. I mean, he was gifted. I mean, and even now, I mean, even as a broadcaster, I mean, he's an incredibly good analyst. He talks far too much, which Benaud would have always pointed out to him. You know, less is more. But you know, that wouldn't come across his. You know. Less is more with Shane just doesn't happen. More is better. Generally, I mean, he had an awkward rapport with some journalists, but he and I have always had a reasonable rapport, and he does respect certain correspondents and one thing or another. He's not a particularly worldly man. You know, as you would always known for his interest in Indian food was fairly modest. So
baked beans.
Baked beans. I mean, he's been known to go to if his mates wanted to go to an Indian restaurant, he's been known to order a pizza into an Indian restaurant. You know, just I mean, what do you say? What do you say? You can't. You know, he's just an enigmatic, unpredictable character, but a genius cricketer who could have been a great leader, could have been a great captain, but not smart enough to know that you have to be more than just a brilliant tactician and analyst. You know, you've got to toe a couple of lines.
Yes, did win the first edition of the IPL with Rajasthan Royals, which was a fairy tale story in itself. And talking about fairy tales, Mike, you know, and this is like the 800th great moment that you were at, of course, which was Calcutta in 2001. The reason why that test The reason why Steve Waugh enforced the follow-on and why India won was because you were there, Mike. Because when you were there, things happened.
Well, he got a lot of criticism for that war, but it was the smart thing to do. It was the right thing to do. And we saw...
Shane Warne doesn't agree, Mike. Shane Warne doesn't agree.
we saw some of the greatest batting you will ever see. You know, I mean, that's when you distill these things. I mean, if it hadn't happened, I mean, we would have been deprived of two of the greatest innings of our time. You know, that's the way it goes. That's the way it goes. Steve Waugh was unapologetic. Australian captains have got a pretty good record of recent times of enforcing the follow-on, just despite a tentativeness thought to have come about because of that. But what a joy it was to see Vivi in that sort of form, not to mention Raul, you know, two of the finest in full cry.
The late Peter Roebuck once told me how he's so fond of that test because by then he was getting bored of writing about Australian victories. And he said there was a certain lift that he felt when that miracle happened because he said, finally, Australia have lost.
Well, they'd won 16 on the trot to that point. So 16 consecutive tests, a fair achievement.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think they did that twice. They did it later under Ricky Ponting as well, which India stopped again in that famous tour. But which brings me, which they stopped in 2008. But Mahesh, go ahead.
No, I was about to talk about the next test, which is the Chennai test. So I wanted to ask him about his memories of the test as well. I mean, we always talk about Calcutta test, but it's not just the Calcutta. The series was elevated because of what happened after that as well. I mean, the Bombay test itself was great. Calcutta is the test for the ages. But the next Chennai test was also quite dramatic.
Yeah, it was. And Warne right in the midst of it again. I don't remember it as well as I probably should, but I know how tight it was and how thrilling it was. I mean, there are some who think that series is as good a series as there's been between the two countries. It was exceptional from the word go. That was when Gilchrist and Hayden got those extraordinary hundreds in Mumbai, wasn't it? In that very dirty deck. Remarkable Gilly in full flight. Yeah, I mean, it was a thrilling series. And I mean, when you look to what happened in England in 2005, in the famous moment with Lee and Kasperowitz and company, if England hadn't gone up then, Ashes cricket was really ready to be filed under miscellaneous. I mean, already the Border-Gavaskar series had assumed an importance that nobody believed it ever would. And now, again, that's going to be the discussion following, you know, England is in such steep decline at the moment and has got its structures wrong domestically. One thing or other, you know, I mean, I can still see that Border-Gavaskar series continuing to be, you know, the dominant competition in world cricket. And I think it's interesting that followers of the game in other countries are as fascinated now with the Border-Gavaskar series as was once the case that the rest of the world is fascinated by the Ashes. You know, there's been a very, very significant switch.
And Mike, you've also, of course, there have been so many great Australian cricketers and world cricketers that you've covered, but I've noticed in your writing and also talking to you over the years that there is a certain fondness that you have for Adam Gilchrist and the way he approached the game, the way he played the game. And it was only fitting that in 2004, when Australia finally won a series in India the first time after 69, it was Gilchrist. And not Ponting, who was at the helm at that time.
Yes, at the helm. The irony, and of course, nobody knew who was at the helm of India at that time.
We still don't know.
No, exactly. Who led in Nagpur?
Dravid.
Who did?
Dravid.
Oh, Dravid. Somewhere, because I can remember Gilly saying, Gilly was expecting someone else, I think. I don't know. There's a very funny story.
Yeah, it was Ganguly who was supposed to be the captain, and Gilchrist expected Ganguly to be at the toss, And when he was walking to the toss, he saw Dravid there, and he asked Dravid what happened. He says, "I don't know."
Yes,
and
exactly.
So,
Exactly. It's absolutely priceless. Absolutely priceless. Gilly's a good man, Sid, a good man in every sense, a wonderful player, continues to contribute to the game in charity work and one thing or another as an educationist. He's exceptional. He's exceptional. And was an exceptional player. He was a revolutionary in the way he played the game. He was absolutely exceptional.
Absolutely. Yeah. Which actually, one of the things that Mike said to me when I got in touch with him recently was that he had read an article that I'd written about Joe Root and Shannon Gabriel. And so we got talking about that incident where Joe Root basically mentioned to Shannon about, the fact that there's nothing wrong in being gay and things. So, Mike, I wanted to talk to you a bit about that. You are perhaps one of the few, if not the only, openly gay cricket writers, definitely the only one I know, and definitely the most high profile. So talk a bit about that, your experiences over the years, and how welcoming was cricket and the cricket writing community towards that, and what were the challenges that you had? And I'd love to hear about that.
Sid, most of the challenges came from, not from within the playing group, but from within my own professional group, I think, probably. I've, like all gay men, you tend to struggle at different times. I've never been out and about waving flags, but everybody knew from the word go within the cricket community that I was gay. And I'll openly say that I've not encountered any prejudice. There's certainly been stuff behind my back. I'm fully aware of that. But not, as I understand it from the players, there might be one or two. But generally they've been accepting, and I've got a good rapport, and I've found them to be non-judgmental. It hasn't been an easy, it's not an easy passage, but I've had terrific support. I've been in a relationship with my partner, Peter, for 40 years. It's a long time. And, and we're just as happy as we were, 40 years ago. So I'm very grateful for that and that support. And Peter's toured on a number of occasions and met a lot of the players. Taught Dean Jones a particular card game on a flight from Mumbai to Sydney on one occasion. He knows Border well. Greg Matthews, many of the players of that period know Peter. So I've been fortunate. I think if you're confident in who you are and you present that way, people respond to you positively. If you present negatively and defensively, invariably that's how people respond to you, negatively and defensively, and unsure how to approach it. You can only be who you are. It wasn't easy for me growing up, but I'm very fortunate to have met Peter when I did, and to have had a very, very happy and long relationship. Malcolm Gray, former chairman of Cricket Australia, was probably the first to invite Peter to functions with me, and that goes back a fair way now into the 80s. So we've always been invited to the Border Medal and things like that as a couple, if need be. So I've been very fortunate from that point of view. But I think that's had a lot to do with the fact of if you're confident in who you are, people will respond to you that way. Certainly, there's been some issues behind the scenes, but that's what it is. That's how it is. It was interestingly, it was my generation, my peers, who had greater difficulty with it than the next generation. That's what I was saying before about. There has been significant change in attitudes, particularly with Australian men, And I think it's the case in India as well. There's a greater openness and understanding. I haven't been back to India for a few years now, but hopefully I'll get back soon. But the attitudes have changed enormously, and that's a much healthier society.
Can you talk a bit about how this whole aspect tended to influence your writing? Because I do see in a lot of Australian writing, especially Australian cricket writing from the 70s and 80s, there is a certain glorification of the open masculinity of that time, and which many have even pointed to toxic masculinity at times. But you have been far more temperate in terms of your writing. I mean, there's been no glorification or anything of that sort. There's been much more a moderate approach to it. Do you think that has played a part?
Oh, I think it's an expression of who you are. I think your writing is an expression of who you are. I think that would be, the little I've read of your work. I think that's very evident as well, and particularly with your love of the young and respect for it. I'd like to think that's the case, but you don't sit down consciously and say that you're going to tackle it in a certain way. I think it's just an expression of your nature. Certainly some of the stuff was pretty confronting in the 70s. I mean, it was very, very aggressive and very abrasive, but, you just had to be who you are. So I'm just grateful I had the strength to get through it, and I had the support, particularly of the next generation down from mine. The ones who are still working now, the Lawlers, the Cons, the Craddocks, the Smithers, so many of them that have, always been very, very supportive. And the older ones, I think, understood as time went by, how unexceptional it really was, if you are who you are. And I think at the moment, the significant thing is that the men's cricket on these issues, on social inclusion and things in gender identity, have to learn so much from the women. The women are so much further down the track. And I think hopefully there's a very good relationship now between Meg Lanning and with Pat Cummins. The two teams get together. And, of course, there's relationships within two teams with Stark and Co. and their wives and Elise Healy. And I think that the men should learn and will learn. Alex Blackwell, a very fine player and a former Australian captain, she's just written a very, very, very good book called Fair Game. And she hasn't minced words with some of the issues dealing with the sort of sexuality of the women in the context. It's a very, very good and I think a significant read. And I think the men can learn a lot from the women.
And what can add, the cricket as a game and with administration and everything else, what can they do? Because even in the ICC code, racism is treated extremely seriously, but homophobia is not on par with it. In fact, it's not. It's just part of the umbrella term of discrimination. So would you reckon, because the number of cricketers in the male domain, there has, in my mind, only Stephen Davies, as far as I know, who has come out openly, wicketkeeper. And obviously, there are many young cricketers, junior cricketers, not necessarily international, but many. And especially in parts like in India and other countries, there is a certain taboo still in certain parts to, come out. So, that what can cricket do, you think, like one or two things they can do better?
Yes. Well, it all comes back to education. Perhaps, would Davies be an ambassador within the context of English cricket? I don't know. I've lost track of him a little bit. And I think that's what it needs. And I think that's where this book of Alex Blackwell's is particularly significant from the women's game. There's a line here, Dylan Alcott, who became Australian of the Year on Australia Day, is a remarkable tennis player, wheelchair tennis player, and has won titles all around the world. And his his pet line is, you can't be what you can't see. You can't be what you can't see. And I think that is so true. And I think it's going to take the emergence of young men with incredible courage who can play as gay cricketers at state level or international level. And that's the only way it's going to be, Sid. And it's going to, I'd like to think that it could happen. But it's going to take, because all the players at the elite level now, they have all these classes. I mean, on inclusion, gender identity, racism. I mean, they get constant coaching and education into what is required and what their responsibility is. So there's no excuses now. You can't hide. And so it's going to really need, you'll see periodically, 2 or 3 of the Australian players will say, of course, or in, say, Australian football, that a gay player would be embraced. Well, just the other day at Adelaide United, Joe Cavallo, a young player, came out, and of course within the next 2 or 3 weeks there was some very ugly incidents in games, and clubs were fined heavily for the homophobic remarks and one thing or other. So there's still a very, very long way to go. There's a great sadness. So much more education is required. But I don't think, I like the Olcott line, you can't be unless you can see it. You've got to be able to see it. And until there's a gay player at that level who's comfortable in himself and proud in what he's doing, it's going to be very, very difficult.
Yeah, I think the women's game is definitely can play a big role in this regard. Yeah. And I also think that the women's game is, the sensibilities are far more different now, different compared to the men. The level of open aggression and just the temperature at which it's played is, lower, and seems more inclusive in that regard for everybody to take part in.
Yeah, very, very much so.
We have a lot of people who listen to our podcast who are interested in cricket. There also some of them are interested in becoming cricket writers and becoming, broadcasters, whatever. What would you, for somebody who's been doing this for 60 years, who has seen cricket for so long, what is there just a short message for them and how they could learn and what they could look for to have like a successful career?
I think the hard thing, Sid, is I've always said historically, no one should be penalised for their passion. But the structure of media is such now. I still believe that's so, but it's so much more difficult now. But I'm not the best to ask, probably, in as much from a philosophical point, yes, but from not understanding the modern media to the degree that I should, or perhaps I don't have to, I don't know. But it is such a completely different world. But the one thing that they should never lose enthusiasm, should not, the passion, must maintain the passion, but they must read. They must read. And not just online. They've got to read history. They've got to be able to have a perspective, to be able to have a context in which they write. And if they do that, they can prosper. One of my godsons in Adelaide is in his early 30s as a freelancer and doing extraordinarily well, not in cricket, in general news, and is doing extraordinarily well at a time when you'd say it's an impossible time to freelance and all work is done by contract. But he's prospering, so it is possible. But he's passionate, he cares, and he's a reader. And to develop that worldliness, it's a wonderful game. Why I was drawn to it is that it is the beautiful game to write about. And it's a game of literature, historically, and it teaches us so much. Just the opportunity to travel and to learn. I can just look back with such affection on my time, particularly in India, Pakistan and Sri Lanka. I wrote most of the Tarrant book in Sri Lanka in 2018. Went back there, had 6 months there, just loved it. like the time that I had in south of Chennai. And it's, so that's what I'd say to them, believe in yourself, be strong, and don't be intimidated by, respect its history, but don't be intimidated by it, and they can flourish.
Wonderful. And when you said reading, it just struck me. We ask most of our guests if they can suggest like a book or two for people to pick up, this cricket book, ideally. But I mean, and this need not be like you saying this is the best book on cricket, but just something that you would recommend people to read, anything that you've read over the years, apart from your books, of course, which I will link.
Gideon Haig's Summer Game should always be read, and for wonderful insights into captains, leadership, and writing about the individual. Ray Robinson's On Top, Down Under. Very difficult. And then the Archie Jackson story by David Frith. If I was to pull three books, Australian books particularly, because I think your listeners and viewers would like to hear of Australian work, they would be the three I'd say. Gideon Haig's Summer Game, Archie Jackson's story by David Frith, and On Top, Down Under by Ray Robinson. And I had the great fortune to work with Ray for a while. He was an amazing man. And that's the other thing. I mean, I knew McGilvray, I knew Arlott, and sat next to Arlott in 72 and at the Oval when Australia drew the series. And he would lean across and say, "Mike, did I ever tell you about?" And then off he would go with something. So just the joy of it's just not only the game, it's the people. And Arlott's great. One of the thing about Arlott was significance that of all the things he did and all the things he achieved, it was heading the Cricketers Association that gave him greatest joy because he loved cricketers and their company. And I think that's the other thing. We can love the game, but we can also have great affection for the people who play it at a level that we could only dream about.
Perfect. And when you say Ray Robinson and McGilvray, I think I should get you on again, Mike, for another episode to talk about all the colleagues, all the wonderful colleagues that you have had a chance to work with. And that'll be a fascinating episode in itself, especially someone like Ray Robinson, who was so revered that I heard a story recently about how when he was in his old age, the Australian players used to actually keep a beer, open a beer and keep it out so that it's not chilled when he comes in, and then he can have a drink at that time.
that was R.W. Marsh would do that. That was Marsh's responsibility.
Absolutely. Yeah. Imagine that, to actually keep a beer for a journalist because they knew that he couldn't have it chilled. I mean, That's the kind of story that you will never hear about now. But we hope to hear from you when you are on next, hopefully, at some point.
Well, it's lovely being with you, Sid. Lovely being with you, Mahesh, and meeting you. And thank you for the opportunity of joining you on the podcast.
Oh, wonderful. It's just absolute privilege to have you, Mike. We're all fans of your writing, and I'm sure the listeners would love every moment of your stories and anecdotes. Okay,
thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you so much for joining this episode. Follow us at 81 All Out on Twitter. Our website is 81allout.com. You can rate and review the podcast wherever you listen to it. And also a reminder about Mike Marques's book, War Minus the Shooting, which we recently republished. It's available on Amazon everywhere now. It's available on Amazon in India as well. It's available in Flipkart in India, Amazon everywhere in the world. And please order it, rate and review. And thank you, Mike. And thank you, Mahesh. Have a good day.
India have won the test match. India have won the series.
They're going to get back for two. India home. Lords goes wild.